The early 90s were a pivotal time for metal, with grunge gaining mainstream dominance, and thrash metal, the defining sound of the previous decade, was beginning to lose momentum. Amid this shift, an album emerged that both reinvigorated and redefined heavy metal, Pantera's Vulgar Display of Power.
Like, subscribe, thank you.
Released in 1992, the album became a genre-defining moment for groove metal and solidified Pantera as one of the most important bands of the era. But how did they craft an album that left such a seismic impact? The answer lies not only in the band's ferocity, but in the methodical and almost scientific approach taken during its recording. What might seem like pure aggression on the surface is in fact the result of top-notch musicianship, calculated engineering decisions, and a meticulous production process. Pantera's previous release, Cowboys from Hell, in 1990 had put them on the map with its aggressive sound, but Vulgar Display of Power was different. It wasn't just aggressive, it was physically punishing, and this was intentional. According to Dimebag Darrell, the goal was to create the heaviest album possible, not just in terms of emotional intensity, but with a sound that smacked listeners with a visceral, gut-punching impact. To understand this process, let's break down the elements that contributed to this sonic intensity. Perhaps the most recognizable element of Vulgar Display of Power is Dimebag Darrell's guitar tone. It's heavy, sharp, extremely distinct, but achieving this wasn't as simple as cranking up the distortion. Dime's tone was the product of carefully curated combinations of guitars, amplifiers, and pedals, as well as precise sound engineering to maintain clarity in the midst of raw aggression. Dimebag's main weapon during the recording of Vulgar Display of Power was his trusty Dean ML, a guitar that became synonymous with his image and sound. The Dean was fitted with a Bill Lawrence L500XL pickup in the bridge position, which played a significant role in shaping the tone. The pickup's a high-output humbucker that delivered the searing highs and tight lows that Dime needed for his signature sound. Its ability to cut through the mix while maintaining clarity made it a perfect fit for that mid-scoop tone that he was going for. The Dean ML's design, with his long sustain and sharp attack, allowed Dime to deliver those powerful chugging riffs that were so prominent on tracks like Walk and Mouth for War. The guitar's body, a combination of mahogany and maple, gave him the warmth and the bite essential for balancing that crushing low end with sparkling highs. Dime's amp of choice for Vulgar of Power was a Randall RG100 ES, which is a solid-state amp that was really crucial to the sound. Unlike tube amps, which provide warmth and organic breakup, the solid-state gave Dime a more compressed, tighter tone that allowed for the brutal precision that he was known for. And the Randall RG100 ES had a distinct character, providing aggressive attack and sharpness without the sag or warmth typically associated with tube amps. And this tight compressed quality is actually what made his sound so percussive. But for the settings, Dime famously lowered the mid-range frequencies while boosting the low and the high to give the guitar that razor-sharp edge for the rhythm. You know, what's good about it is that he was able to avoid adding any kind of muddiness to the mix. Everything always just sat right with the rhythm section. While Dime's tone was centered around his guitar and amp setup, a few key pedals helped shape the details. One of the most great effect on a few solos on this album, where he would stomp on it and send his solos way off into the world of chaos. Dime also employed a bit of modulation as well, using the MXR flanger doubler. And this added some subtle modulation effects to the rhythm as well as his leads, giving his tone a slightly detuned quality that thickened the sound. It was definitely a magic pedal in his arsenal for sure. Achieving Dime's tone wasn't just all about the gear, it was also the way it was captured. Terry Date, who was the producer, took a methodical approach to recording Dime's guitar, employing a multi-mic setup that was essential in capturing the full spectrum of the sound. One of the biggest things that you would hear on a Pantera album, especially this one, as well as some of Metallica's most popular work on Master of Puppets, for example, is that if you listen really hard, you can actually hear the resonance of the cabinet. And on Vulgar Display of Power, Terry was able to really capture Dimebag's cabinet resonance to great effect. One big technical decision Pantera made for the album was to tune down a half step from standard tuning. And this made the album overall darker and much more menacing. But it also did something else too. When you listen to the vibrato, say in the solo of Walk, for example, Dime was able to get some insane vibrato happening because he really took advantage of the reduced string tension. Now, another trick that Terry Date employed for this album was that he used a lot of reamping, which means that he'd be able to capture the amplified tone, but also split it off as well, so that all you had was basically just the direct guitar going into the mixing console onto its own track. And so this way you just have this bare guitar that could then be run into another amplifier or series of amplifiers. And he could continue to layer all sorts of different amp sounds so that they could really dial in exactly what they wanted for each song. And that definitely contributed to a lot of the magic of Dime's tone on the album. And while Dimebag's guitar tone is the most immediately recognizable aspect of the album, Vinnie Paul's drumming provided the foundation on which everything was built. Both Vinnie and Rex Brown just really locked in with one another to create a really tight, punchy rhythm section throughout. Vinnie's drums were recorded with an emphasis on capturing both raw power as well as precision. And to achieve this, Terry Date used a combination of close mics as well as room mics, carefully blending the two to give the drums both that punch, but also that thunderous roar. And another standout thing about Vinnie was that he was never shy about triggering samples either. So often to give his drums that extra bit of attack that you didn't really hear from a lot of other drummers, they cleverly blended in triggers, which would set off samples that were in perfect time with his drums, and then they would just dial it in just right so that there was a real smack and crack. You could especially hear it in the snare drum, but also in the kick too. And that's really one thing they say about any recording, is that in the end, it is only as good as its drum sounds. And there's a big reason for that. The drums are really what anchor the recording. So if you imagine this entire Pantera album recorded, but there was a cheesy drum machine playing in the background instead of Vinnie Paul's drums, it would sound a little bit on the silly side, though it would make for a pretty interesting novelty nonetheless. Phil Anselmo's vocal performance on Vulgar Display of Power is a masterclass in controlled chaos. His voice is searing and aggressive and raw, but there's a precision to his delivery that elevates it beyond mere shouting. Anselmo's vocal approach was to embody the rage and intensity of the lyrics, but with enough clarity that listeners could hear every word. And the vocal production was equally meticulous. Anselmo's vocals were recorded with a dynamic microphone, often a Shure SM58, which is a standard in live performances but less common in the studio. And the choice of the dynamic mic was deliberate. It really let Phil push his voice to its limits without actually distorting the signal. Interestingly enough, in the song Fucking Hostile, Phil actually sang that standing right at the mixing desk. And at the very end, he just took his microphone and chucked it into the garbage can that was right there. And so you could hear the feedback coming from it as it was resonating through the monitors that they had right there at the mixing console. What's also interesting about the vocals on this album is that Terry Date used subtle layering techniques oftentimes to thicken Phil's voice during key moments. And it was used really sparingly, and generally the doubling was pretty tight, but it definitely added a whole new dimension to Phil's voice. Rex Brown's bass playing often gets overlooked, but it was a critical element of the album's sound. His bass lines, though not as flashy as Dime's guitar work, provided that glue that held the band's sound together. And for that, his bass was recorded with both a DI as well as an amplifier, with two signals blended together to create a thick, aggressive tone. The DI provided clarity, brevity, and punch, while the amp added a warmth and a grit to the sound. And this way they were able to really balance it, having that bass cut through the mix but without overpowering the other instrument. And of course, one of the biggest challenges was making sure that the bass did not clash with Dime's guitar. But to Terry Date's credit, he really spent a lot of time applying a lot of precise EQing, and Vinnie was also a part of this as well. So the album opens up with Mouth for War, which is an explosion of groove-laden aggression. The riff is built around a tight, chugging rhythm where Dime's control over his picking is impeccable. Every note is carefully articulated with a mix of palm muting and open power chords, giving this song this relentless driving force. The precision of Dime's playing makes this track feel like a well-oiled machine, while the crushing groove adds layers of weight to the music. The breakdown halfway through showcases how Pantera could seamlessly shift between tempos without losing intensity. The guitar's drop in speed paired with Vinnie Paul's thundering double bass drumming allows that riff to breathe, amplifying its power. Dimebag's solo on this was really cool, blending that melodic approach with speed and feel in a way that really balances the aggression with a sense of artistry. Lyrically, Phil Anselmo channels his anger into motivation, spinning rage into productivity. And the mix is razor sharp, with Dime's intricacies shining through and Rex's bass holding that whole thing together. A New Level continues this theme of self-empowerment introduced in Mouth for War. The song's built around one of Pantera's most iconic riffs, a perfect marriage of groove and aggression. The riff itself uses a power chord-heavy structure, using slides to build up a sense of momentum and pushing that song forward. And the song reflects the band's confidence at this point in their career. They're truly reaching a new level of confidence and power, as the lyrics proclaim. And this sense of ascension isn't just metaphorical. By '92, Pantera was poised to become one of the most important metal bands of their generation, and this track captures that swagger. It's not flashy for the sake of being flashy. It's just each note serves the song's intensity perfectly. And for the solo, Dime kicks in some insane wide intervallic jumps and quick runs that contrast the slower, grinding pace of the rhythm section. Equally insane were Vinny's kick patterns that he was doing to lock in with the guitar riff, reinforcing the groove. The third song, Walk, is all about simplicity done to perfection. That iconic riff is a masterclass in how less can sometimes be more. Of course, if you asked Yngwie that, he would not agree, but Dime did offer him a donut, but Yngwie turned down having more from Dime. Nevertheless, Dimebag Darrell takes his time with each note in this one, letting them breathe and resonate, creating this heavy, undeniable groove. And the space between the notes allows that riff to hit even harder, giving the song this hypnotic, headbanging energy. But where Walk truly stands out is in its solo. Dime approaches solo as if he were a blues player, but straight out of hell. It's not a real flashy technical barrage. Instead, it's an evil, snake-like descent into something darker. The way Dime bends the notes and the sinister phrasing and his masterful vibrato really created this haunting atmosphere. The vibrato in particular just sends shivers down the spine, because it's really like he just took blues into this whole evil realm. So yeah, I mean, it is a blues solo, but one that feels drenched in malice, twisting familiar blues tropes into something much more menacing. What's cool about solo too is that there's a sense of space and tension, with each note carefully chosen and rung out for maximum effect. He basically starts it off in a minor pentatonic, but he was really taking advantage of that slack that he had in the strings, so often he was bending minor thirds to major thirds. So it almost sounded a little bit kind of more Mixolydian in some places. And then when it would change key, it sounded a bit more minor pentatonic, and he started almost throwing in some blues cliches, but you know they're not blues cliches because there's just something else going on. And then bam, all of a sudden he smacks you upside the head with this diminished lick that just took it into pure horror show mode before going back to the main riff. Lyrically, Walk is a defiant anthem. Respect, walk, are you talking to me? And Phil's screams on this song fit it just so perfectly. It was a bit during the verses as if he might have sort of revisited the glam metal days slightly, in the fact that he was just carrying such a melodic scream. But there was no glam to this track. It was pure all-out assault. But it still had some of those cool elements from the earlier days in it in terms of Phil's vocal. And of course the groove itself, it's as heavy as any thrash metal out there, and yet it had a swing to it. And this hit a lot of listeners' ears like, whoa, now we're hearing something truly different. And that's really why this song served as a huge catapult for this entire album. And then they go into what a lot of people would argue might be the tour de force on this in terms of their heaviness, which is the song Fucking Hostile. They absolutely freaking kick it up a notch for this one. And it's only 3 minutes long, but it's pure unfiltered aggression, both lyrically and as well as with its relentless tempo. It's an all-out thrash assault on the senses, leaving no room for breathing. It starts right off just grabbing the listener's attention. And what really stands out on this one is Dime's rapid-fire speed picking. During those rhythms, I mean, his playing wasn't only fast, but it was just incredibly tight. Each note meticulously picked and palm muted with surgical precision. And lyrically, the song doesn't pull any punches. It's an expression of Phil's rage and frustration with authority and hypocrisy and societal norms and all the fun stuff we get to live with day to day. And Anselmo's vocal delivery on this was venomous, but yet enunciated enough that you could hear every single word landing with precision. And then comes that solo, true highlight of Dimebag's unpredictability. This wah-infused, off-the-rails solo is pure beautiful chaos, fully wild, frenetic, and absolutely electrifying. And on this one, Dime really let loose unleashing this flurry of bends, harmonics, and screaming notes that sound as chaotic as they do controlled. It's a solo that's unpredictable, wild, and yet executed with the kind of finesse that only Dime could deliver. And from a production standpoint, Terry Date made the decision to keep this track raw and live feeling. Because of the fact that they wanted to capture that immediacy of the vocals by just having Phil out there in the actual control room, where of course he chucked the mic in the garbage can and gave it that signature sound at the very end of the track. But it's great because it's like a snapshot of the band at their most unhinged, and yet even in their intensity, every instrument is clear, allowing the tightness of Dime's picking and Vinny's drumming to just come through with full force. And this Love is one of the most dynamic tracks on the album, starting with this slow, brooding, almost ballad-like intro, before exploding into one of the heaviest breakdowns on the record. The contrast between that mellow, clean opening and the crushing heaviness of the rest of the song really highlights Pantera's ability to play with these dynamics in a way that metal bands, especially that heavy, really couldn't quite pull off the way Pantera did. Phil's screams on this one really explored the high end of his range. And they also incorporated a lot of space in those riffs, which just made it even that much more haunting. And lyrically, the song kind of goes into the more darker side of relationships, focusing on betrayal and emotional manipulation. The Phil's vocal delivery on the softer parts is kind of almost restrained, but then when that heavy section hits, look the hell out, full of anger and frustration. And Vinnie Paul's drumming on this track stands out for its use of the dynamics as well, shifting from that subtle, understated rhythms into just that thunderous pattern that just completely locks in with Rex and Dime. And this one's truly headphone candy as well, with the way that the guitars were all panned out. The next song, Rise, is a call to arms, both musically and lyrically. It's a really fast-paced, aggressive attack on conformity and complacence. And the riffing in this song is just relentless, with Dime using rapid, palm-muted power chords interspersed with brief moments of melodic lead lines. It's a track that feels like it's always moving forward, never letting up. And lyrically, it encourages listeners to stand up for themselves, not fall victim to all the pressures of day-to-day life. That chorus, when it's almost screaming, rise, resist, resist, is a rallying cry for self-empowerment. And that's really kind of a theme that just runs throughout the entire album. And Dime really took that solo up a few notches with some really fast alternate picking and some wide bends that gave it almost a chaotic feel at points. But even in all of that, Dime's sense of melody really shines through, making the solo memorable and full of impact. In terms of production, the focus is on keeping that energy high. The guitars are pushed right out to the front of the mix, with the bass and drums locked really tightly underneath, basically creating a wall of sound that's just driving that song forward. Song number 7, No Good, Attack the Radical, takes a totally different approach, with the lyrics focusing much more on inequality, basically. And it's got kind of a mid-tempo groove happening with this riff that alternates between dissonant chords and then chugging palm-muted power chords. And Phil's lyrics in this song are really biting. The lines no black, no white, no in-between have kind of a message of unity, but they're delivered with this sense of frustration and anger. And of course, that's Phil for you. I mean, when he let loose in that mic, he let loose. And for the solo, Dime takes a more melodic approach, using some really tasty bends and slides to create almost a vocal-like quality. And the contrast between the dissonance of the main riff and the smoothness of the solo adds to the song's tension, reflecting the conflict that's inherent in the lyrics. And the song was mixed to really emphasize the groove, with the bass and drums creating that solid foundation for the guitars to sit on top of. There's a sense of space in this mix, where each instrument can be heard clearly without losing the heaviness. Track 8, Live in a Hole, features one of the more intricate riff structures on the album, with Dime blending hammer-ons, pull-offs, and slides into the main riff, creating this fluid, almost liquid sound. And the riff seems to flow effortlessly, but beneath the surface, it's technically challenging and complex. Lyrically, Phil goes into some stuff about isolation and frustration, with lines like, I'll stay right here, I live in a hole. And he really put across that sense of entrapment and anger. And the music was a perfect complement, alternating between slower, groove-laden sections and faster, more aggressive passages. Vinny really stood out on this one, with intricate cymbal work as well as well-placed accents, complementing the complexity of the guitar riff. Regular People, Conceit, the 9th track, is a statement against arrogance and self-importance, with Anselmo's lyrics calling out those who believe that they're better than others. And the riff work is dense and rhythmically complex, with Dime using syncopation to keep the listener off balance. A lot of really cool fast speed picking as well as some palm-muted power chords. But there's a surprising amount of melody that's actually buried in the chaos. And then that chorus goes more into the straightforward vibe, providing a contrast to the verse's complexity. And Dime really swung for the fences for the solo, using a lot of harmonics and cool wide bends to create this unique, almost disorienting sound. And then track 10 by Demons Be Driven is one of the darkest tracks on the album. Features a riff that has some really cool dissonance, but also a lot of crushing heaviness in it. And the riff's descending pattern gives that song a menacing feel, as if it's constantly pulling the listener down into a darker place. The lyrics are about themes of inner conflict and temptation, with Anselmo delivering lines like "By demons be driven, by soul be torn." And interestingly, Dime's guitar is slightly more distorted here than on other tracks, adding to that sense of darkness and chaos. The closing track, Hollow, is another dynamic piece, starting off slow and clean before transitioning into one of the heaviest sections on the album. The clean guitar intro is haunting, with Dime using arpeggios to create a sense of melancholy. And lyrically, Hollow turned out to actually be one of the more personal songs in the album, dealing with the loss of a close friend. Phil takes a real subdued approach in the intro, and then when that heavy section hits, he just loses it, hitting with a real powerful emotional performance. And the contrast between the soft and the heavy sections mirrors the emotional complexity of the song's subject matter. And the rhythm section features some of the most intense riffing on the album, totally locking in with Dimebag, where Dime and Rex create this massive wall of sound. In terms of production, there was a lot of tasteful use of like reverb so that they could get atmosphere, especially during some of the slower sections. And then all of a sudden it just gets really tight and compressed for the heavy section. Vulgar Display of Power didn't just set a new standard for metal. It redefined what heavy music could be. The album's influence could be heard in countless bands that followed, from groove metal pioneers like Lamb of God to modern metalcore acts. But what's remarkable about the album is how well it has aged. Despite being over 3 decades old, Vulgar Display of Power still sounds as fresh and aggressive as it did back in '92. Its production is timeless, and the engineering that went into its creation was just brilliant. The cover art for Vulgar Display of Power was developed through a process that mirrored the intensity of the album itself: direct, aggressive, and no nonsense. The band's vision was clear from the outset. They wanted a visual that hit as hard as the music. And the initial spark came from Dimebag Darrell. He had a simple but striking idea: a distorted face, something that visually represented the chaotic, brutal sound of the album. So he played around with a photocopy, dragging a photo across the machine while it was scanning, creating that smeared, distorted effect. And it captured that tension and disruption vibe that the band wanted to evoke on the album. But of course, that would not make it to the final design. When the band presented their ideas to the label, their request was straightforward. They just didn't want abstract imagery or symbolism. They wanted something that would just shock people when they looked at it. They're like, we want something vulgar, like a dude getting punched in the face. And it was a perfect representation of the album's title, Vulgar Display of Power, which is about raw force, lyrically and sonically. So the label said, okay. And they presented this concept featuring a boxer wearing a glove. It was really clean and professional and completely off base from what the band wanted. Pantera immediately rejected it, feeling like the image was just way too polished. They wanted that street-level aggression, and this was not it. And the real problem with it was that the boxing glove concept symbolized more of that controlled, regulated violence, something that just didn't work with this vibe. It was supposed to be unstaged, unconstrained. So the label came back with a second version, and this time they nailed it. The new proposal featured a bare fist, mid-punched, connecting with a man's face. And the skin would ripple with the force of the impact, and the man's expression would be one of pain and surprise. It was raw, real, and exactly what the band wanted. So the photograph was shot by Brad Gruis, a photographer known for his work with musicians, and the man whose face was to be subject to this was Sean Cross, and he posed for the image. And there were a lot of rumors saying that he was punched 30 times in order to get the perfect take. But no, the impact was actually staged, and they used high-speed photography and precise lighting to make it look as real as possible. And the fist just kind of slowly pressed into the face, making it a little bit distorted. And that was it. That was exactly what the band wanted. No distractions, really simple, a fist connecting with a face in black and white. When Vulgar Display of Power was released on February 25th, '92, it hit the heavy metal world like a wrecking ball. However, its success was not that immediate. And part of the problem was that in the early '90s, metal was kind of at a crossroads. I mean, grunge was totally exploding on the scene, and it was pulling a lot of the attention away from some of the heavier, more aggressive styles of metal. And of course, we all know what was happening with hair metal at that time, but also the heavier groups at the time were not having a good go of it either. When it was released, a lot of critics didn't quite know how to take it, but a lot of them, as well as fans, were just struck by the relentless aggression and groove-oriented sound, which really set it apart from a lot more of the technical thrash and virtuosic shredding that had dominated a lot of the 80s metal scene. There was virtuosic playing, but it wasn't like they were trying to be virtuoso. Instead, it was just coming out naturally. And while Cowboys from Hell had already established the band as a major player in the metal world, Vulgar Display of Power took things to a whole new level. It was heavier, more focused, and far more aggressive. But as word of mouth spread, the album started doing better and better. And to date, it's easily one of the most influential metal albums of all time. And Walk especially had such a huge impact on the listeners, and it received significant radio airplay, quickly becoming a fan favorite. It had universal appeal. People loved its heaviness, but that swinginess and just such a unique sound going on. And the album would go on to sell over 2 million copies in the US alone, eventually going double platinum. And a lot of that had to do also with the band's relentless touring schedule. Pantera toured heavily to promote this album, smacking fans upside the head with that raw, aggressive energy all over the globe. And so as the band's reputation grew, so did the album's sales. But the main takeaway from this album is that it really showed that metal could evolve, strip down, and rebuild itself while staying true to its roots. Vulgar Display of Power wasn't just an album, it was a statement. A statement that metal, just like a bare-fisted punch, could still knock you flat out when done right. Something really weird, I just found out the most expensive guitar on Amazon is a signature guitar, and you won't believe whose signature guitar it is. I left the link below in the description. And to my subscribers, I really want to thank you so much for all the inspiration and feedback. I truly do appreciate it. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe to this channel, make sure you smack that subscribe button. And while you're at it, hit the like button, join the family, and want to thank you so much for watching.